Point of introduction, I'm Chris Barker, Vice President on the Valley of the Sun chapter for ACT, and it's a pleasure to have you all join us. This is our final webinar for 2021, and we are thrilled to bring back Mike Courtney by very popular demand. Those of you who had the pleasure of joining our session last year, Mike is the CEO and founder for Aperio Insights. Is a futurist and gave us a lot of really interesting thoughts to ponder a year ago in December. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we can expect as we move into 2022 as far as transportation trends and innovation and things that are going on. And I guess before we get into your remarks, Mike, as we look back to a year ago to December, and some of the things that we talked about, what are your thoughts on what you thought was going to happen and what perhaps has actually happened over 2021, which has obviously been a pretty interesting year?
You know, it's been an interesting year, Chris, but as a futurist, it's tough to get surprised. I mean, in fact, we really look forward to surprises because other things like, ooh, how did that happen? I didn't really see or understand that could or would happen. But a lot of things really sort of stay on course in our world. The thing we have to think about when we think about the future is that it's not as often that you're going to really be surprised by something, particularly like a technology that comes out of nowhere, like, what's that? But it's more about the execution of the things that we've seen on the horizon for a while, that we see different implementations that you're like, oh, they did something different with that. So it's, for us, it's more how people execute and how they've done the things that we expected somebody would do in some way. Sometimes the players change, sometimes how they've executed it changes, and they make a little bit more or less progress than we had hoped or expected. But for the most part, we weren't super surprised by most things.
Okay.
But there's still time.
This definitely feels like a year of maybe some recovery, a bit uneven of sorts in different parts of our world and transportation. Clearly the COVID situation is ebbed and flowed. So look forward to hearing your thoughts on what lies ahead in 2022. And with that, I will happily turn it over to you to share some really interesting insights.
Sure. Well, so, and I asked in the chat if they were tell us where you're from. We'd love to start the chat going. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can address them either on the fly or at the end. I'm currently in Dallas, Texas. I don't know if anybody else is in this part of the world, but I'm from a little teeny town in upstate New York. And this is an actual picture, which looks much better than the town actually does. But, and I can almost see the rooftop of the area where I actually grew up. And it was a little town that wasn't really known for much. We had, small industries, and we had a couple of big supermax prisons. But other than that, we didn't have much. But we were all, as children, all of us did architecture. All of us were involved in building things. And I don't know if that's because of an upstate New York thing, or it was because perhaps of snow. We always had a lot of snow in upstate New York. And when you have a lot of snow, you build things. And so we all started off as young architects and builders. And we thought we were building things like this that were much more grand than perhaps they actually were. But often it was other things that, even if it wasn't snowing out, who didn't do the whole blanket with chairs thing? And we built things. But when we build things, we had assumptions. And that's what I want to start off thinking today is how we think about and make assumptions. Because even when we're in this mode as a child, we have certain assumptions. We pretend or imagine. We also have the assumption that says, okay, well, mom or dad's not going to immediately come over and tell me to tear this thing down. They're going to let me do this for a while. We have assumptions about what that environment's like. When we think about the things that are built, and we think about the assumptions that are made when they're being built, and you can look at objects in the world and say, okay, what assumptions do people have when they built them, right? This is a picture of a home in a village where they don't have doors on their home. So what assumptions does that community have to say, hey, I can build a structure and not actually have doors? Maybe they assume that people are honest, or assume that nobody's going to come in unannounced or steal things when they're not there, but they make assumptions. If we were building a new home today, what assumptions would we make? We'd probably, even if it hadn't rained in a while, even if we lived in, I don't know, someplace like Valley of the Sun, Arizona area, we'd probably still say, well, it hasn't rained in a while, but I have to plan for the future. I have to think, okay, even if it hasn't rained for a while, and in theory, if it doesn't rain, maybe I don't need a roof, but we have to plan for things that could occur. So we wouldn't probably build a house without a roof, because we have to think about things like seasons. And so that's where futurist thinking, again, begins to come in and impact our assumptions. Even if it's not something we're experiencing now, we can't just assume that we won't experience it in the future. There's indications, whether in the case of weather, history and historical, say, well, yeah, we haven't had snow in a while, but we tend to get to snow every once in a while, once a year maybe, or once every other year through Texas. So we think about things, even if we haven't experienced them before or haven't experienced them in a while, we have to plan for those things, and we have to take those assumptions into account. People that built this structure probably have some assumptions, maybe conditions that we don't have. We can maybe assume that they don't really use candles much, or maybe anything that includes an open flame. When you look at houses like this, you're like, okay, based on this image alone, what assumptions can we make? We can make an assumption that maybe they either don't have a good power source or don't like that power company and want to be on their own. We can make an assumption that maybe a certain amount of space is just fine for them, and that they like the outdoors. So when we think about the future of transportation, just like when we think about housing or any other structures or systems out there, we need to think about what foundational assumptions are we missing. And in fact, when you look at this image, take a moment and say, what's missing? And or what do we know about these people? Okay, well, we have bars on the screen door, so maybe they live in an area that might get might have to keep people out. We can maybe assume that the guy's lawnmower is broken. That's a little while.
That's what I was going to say.
It's like which might assume that maybe the spouse is away on a trip, and the person left at home is relieved from somebody saying, please mow the lawn. So, but maybe there's other foundational assumptions that we're missing, things that are sort of just out of reach, just out of sight, that we don't think about, or we don't view, we don't observe, and perhaps until it's a little bit too late, that, maybe they did build a little close to that cliff, and maybe they say, well, the water's over there, my house is over here. Yeah, but let's think about the future a little bit. Let's plan. Let's challenge our assumptions that says, I'm going to build this house on ground and land, and it'll always be here. Well, maybe we challenge some of those assumptions about what we have today, what we might have tomorrow, and how things might need to change. So, in a sense, what could be around the corner? Things that we see versus things we don't see. We sort of have to imagine a little bit. So, as with homes, things can happen sometimes unexpected. We can, have frozen pipes or things that leak. Sometimes the things that leak or are planned, sometimes are unplanned. Things can happen when you have a household. And those things can sort of result in changes that, somewhat predictable when certain things happen. Hey, that office that I really liked is going to become a baby's room. Other things that if A, then B, C, D is pretty clear. But the first thing we have to do is imagine, well, what's that A step that might occur? And then think through the rest of the chain of a chain reaction. Some things that happen that are unexpected are good things. We don't want to think about the future and say, it's unknown, or it could be unexpected, therefore I should worry about it. Some of the things that happen are really, really positive. Things you're like, thank God that happened. I didn't expect it at all, but that's fantastic that it did. I'm really, really thrilled. So as futurists, we tend to see the future more in this realm. We tend to see it as, we'd love to be surprised, but even if it happens roughly the things that we're imagining, we're somewhat happy, because we know that technology in and of itself, its goal of technology is to make human lives better and to relieve us of doing things that we don't want to do or that cause us pain and suffering. And so in general, the world's getting to be a better and better place, even if on day to day, we don't necessarily feel that or experience that. In general, the surprises in the future are largely positive. So I think we touched on this last year, but when we think about the future, we also think about which things are moving slowly and which things are moving really quickly. And for most of us these days, I think that, the world seems like it's moving really, really quickly, which might mean that you say, well, it's moving so fast, I don't have time to think about the future. Things are going too quickly. But if we think about time in vehicles, if we're going really, really slow, whether grandma's driving or, somebody who just doesn't like to put their foot down, then you have lots of time to react. You have lots of time to course correct. If I'm going 10 or 20 miles an hour, anything can happen in front of me. And I'm like, no problem. I can stop in plenty of time. I can adjust in plenty of time. But most of us, I think, live more sort of life in the fast lane where things are so busy, things are happening so quickly that we really need to be looking farther down the track. We need to be looking farther down the road to really understand what we can see and imagine the things that we can't, so we can plan what's going to happen if the corner that I can't see around and I'm going 100 miles an hour, I say, well, what if there's traffic there? What if there's gravel? What if there's things that would cause me to have to do something? What would I do? How quickly can I notice those things? And do I have a plan to react and not get caught off guard, so to speak? So this brings us to the general idea of what foresight is. And the easiest way to remember it is the hindsight, insight, foresight. Everybody remembers hindsight, looking at the past. What are those things that I wish I didn't do and I shouldn't have done because I knew, but I did them anyway? Insight's looking at today. It's what most of us do for most of our job is apply our knowledge and expertise and look at the present and have insight into what's happening and why. But foresight, simply doing these two things, looking out in advance. And it's something that we all do in our personal lives. We think about what we can and should or shouldn't do when we look forward. But we don't often remember to do it for business. And it's an important thing that we need to do for business, is simply take the time to look out at the future and challenge assumptions. So let's get into a little section on technology. And as we look at it, I want you to think not only what's the future going to be in 2022 or beyond, but how far out are we going? When people ask futurist questions, they're, what's the future going to be? I'm like, well, how far out are you thinking? A year, 6 months, 5 years, 10 years? And we like to look out far enough to really say how much change could really happen. And sometimes a year isn't far enough. But the other important question that we often forget about is, well, when do you need to prepare? So when do we prepare for next year? Well, do we wait till December? Do we wait till January? Is preparation for 2022 maybe something we should have started a little bit back in 2018, 2017, 2019? So as we're looking through the technologies, think about how far out are you looking at those technologies? And when you think about your assumptions of them, how far out are you looking? And then also ask yourself, when do I need to prepare to make use of them and or to be not caught off guard or be, close contact? So how far out are you looking? When do you need to prepare? And again, challenge your assumptions as we go through. We're going to be looking at some technologies, but the trilogy that we often work with as a future group is we look at technologies and we look then at the driving forces, which are really the things that cause human behavior to change. Because even though technology does all sorts of great things, our decisions are really driven by what consumers want, what end users do, how humans themselves think, feel, act. So those are what we call driving forces. And then to make sure that we don't, as futurists, just imagine bright, shiny objects that would never really happen and don't really matter and can't be, utilized, we then focus on timeless needs. And timeless needs, I think we covered last year as well, the idea that there are things we did in the past, things that we do today, and things that we will do in the future. They're timeless needs. Things like cleaning your home, something we did in the past, even back in caveman days, your great grand relatives probably cleaned their cave or their hut. Maybe they weren't able to go to Walmart and buy a broom or anything, but they took a branch with some leaves and they swept things up. Then eventually you could buy brooms and buy vacuums. Today we have robot vacuums, and in the future we might have surfaces that clean themselves, or push the dirt out the door and all on their own without even a robot. But the timeless need is cleaning the home. The timeless need is being safe, secure, those kind of things. So we want to look at technology. We want to see how consumers are changing, how they think and feel, and then how these combinations of technologies and driving forces can satisfy timeless needs in a different way. And it's basically the idea of removing that technology layer, sort of like you might remove a sweater and say, hey, do I always have to wear a sweater? Well, come summertime, probably not, because things change. But if I can remove something and then put something back on fresh in its place, maybe I remove a bus and put an airplane in this place, or I remove a car and put a drone or an air taxi in this place. So, but the timeless needs of transportation will always be there. So we want to think about timeless needs. So that's sort of the trilogy. Again, just keep in mind as we go forth. So enabling technologies, I picked 14 that from a larger list of things that we work with, and focus on things that might have some impact or role in transportation over the next 10 years. They're technologies that you've probably heard of, but we're just going to try to think through them a little bit differently, and again, challenge our assumptions, including how quickly you think they might evolve. Some of these have been on the docket for a while, maybe haven't done everything that we thought they could. So how quickly might they evolve? Where we might find other emerging technologies, things that complement or support or even replace, and then explore how would you test these to prepare for mainstream use. So keep these things in mind. We look a little bit at mainstream adoption when we look at technologies. And so we've sort of roughly bucketed things into when we might start to get more mainstream adoption for certain items, but the timing doesn't really matter as much as matters when do we start thinking about them, when do we start playing with them, experimenting and testing things out. And the main message here isn't to say, well, if things like autonomous vehicles aren't going to be mainstream for 5 years, why do anything today is really the wrong approach. We need to not wait for the future. We need to take off now. We need to start planning and challenging assumptions and thinking through what can we do now, even though mainstream might be years away, because years go pretty quickly. And before you know it, we're 10 years in the future, like, wow, that went really quick. And you'll be glad that you started it. So let's jump right in. And when we think about transportation, I had to start with autonomous vehicles, of course, because it's transportation related. And one of the observations are they're growing, right? They're becoming increasingly capable of safe operation without human involvement, cost effective. They're being used in closed loop environments to move cargo and people. So we are seeing them. That's great. And they're expected to do all the things we've imagined that they would do for quite a long time, which is really reduce accidents due to human errors. There was a data point from, I think, 3 years ago that said that even as of 3 years ago, that autonomous vehicles were already better than human drivers. They weren't perfect, but they were already 25% better. And since then, they've increased. And we have to keep in mind that in this country today, we lose about 40,000 lives a year due to automobile accidents, vehicle accidents. So even if autonomous vehicle is 25% better, that can save 10,000 out of the 40,000 people, that's still great. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where the true nobody ever is harmed ever in an accident, because we can still have all sorts of things occur that aren't the result of what the AV did, but we do look at those things. Advanced air mobility. So we assume that ground transportation, of course, will continue and be a popular dominant form of transportation, but we're also looking at things that are in the air more and more, in fact, more than we've ever done in the past. So ongoing collaboration between all the different groups that manage these things are starting to build out this infrastructure and regulation to manage all these things that we have the technical ability to do it. We have the technology. Now we need the systems to organize it so it's not just a big hot mess in the air. And groups like Airport and their service providers can really do fantastic things as we move forward. Everything from moving people and objects, but keeping track of systems, managing wildlife, managing surveying areas for foreign objects, all the things you might be able to do because you can put something in the air for temporary or on a systematic way. And again, drones in general. The idea that even near us here in Dallas, we have drone deliveries happening up in like Little Oak and McKinney, things that even 2, 3, 4 years ago, people looked at and said, oh, cool idea, but it will never happen because, well, guess what? It's happening. So we have to challenge those assumptions when we think things, when we see items that we're like, that's really cool, but it's never going to really happen, or it's going to be way, way far out. It's a little too cool. It's a little too crazy. We have to challenge those assumptions. Say, well, what would make it true? And is somebody working on that? And you may not know because you're not in that specific sector, but we also have to challenge our assumptions and say, well, who might make that happen? Who might make it true? Because where there's a will, there's a way, and there's a lot of activity going on globally in there. Vertical takeoff aviation, another technology that is part of this whole trend. Morgan Stanley estimating that autonomous urban aircraft, $1.5 trillion industry by 2040. Other people think that they're being a little bit too conservative. It might be more in the 2035 range. But again, lots of activity in things that include vertical takeoff as opposed to conventional takeoff and landing systems. eVTOLs, electric versus other fuels. This is actually an image of a combination unit that actually takes off vertically and then separates those two pieces. And then the plane part flies like a normal plane, albeit electric. And then when it's ready to land again, can either land like a conventional plane or dock back up to that VTOL drone component and come back down and land like a drone would. So again, when we think about aircraft, we can't just assume it's going to be one or the other. This is an organization that's challenging it and saying it can be both. It can be a mixture of the two. And when we have the mixture of the two, and or at least have a vertical, we're able to do things that really extend what an airport could be, extend where flight's useful and beneficial for businesses and for consumers. A lot of the things I've been talking about so far, of course, include electricity, electrification. And it's really odd that in the year 2021, there's so much emphasis on electricity because you think, well, we've had electricity for like 100 years. So surely we've sort of done everything we can do with it, but we haven't. Battery technology is changing. The weight per kilowatt is dramatically increasing and lots of efforts still focused on that. So we're able to use electricity for a lot of things that in the past it just wasn't feasible for. So electrification is going to be a really, really huge initiative and wave that we'll see over the next decade or so that will again change our transportation systems, whether it's aviation or ground transportation, in ways that I'm sure we haven't fully thought through. One of the other things that electrification does or requires really is we've got to get that energy closer to where it's going to be used. So it's one thing to say, well, if I'm using a petroleum fuel, I can, pump it out over here, ship it into a refinery, pump it through trucks and pipelines and get it to where it needs to go. But electricity, somewhat different. I think we're going to see a lot more localized energy creation. And I think, again, that's going to change how we use transportation. When energy is produced locally, there's all sorts of things that we can do. Touchless. Let's get into the technologies of how humans actually interact with things. That's one thing I know we've continued to see this year that really was put into higher gear last year. The idea that as we go through the world and travel, that consumers, because of COVID, are like, hey, I don't want to touch those things. I don't know who's touched that last. I don't want to get something from that surface. So we've seen a huge explosion in touchless technology and systems that really use cutting edge technology in terms of haptic, touchless, things where you can actually feel things in the air that aren't there. So increased quality in the voice recognition and gesture control systems that exist. And if you've been to an airport or other public spaces lately and seen some of these things, it's really fascinating to see people that, might be, an older consumer or grandparent that has become comfortable and familiar with saying, oh yeah, I just do this and it works like that. And that's the cool thing about touchless, is that it allows us to create interfaces that can change just with software. I don't have to say, we added a new feature, so we're going to have to change that out and put a button there or add another button. It's touchless. We can just add an air button. We can just add a piece of software or another item on the screen, and the user interface can change to be something that, even based on gesture, we can use without training. And we can learn that says, hey, these older guys that keep coming up and doing X, we're all trying to do this. Let's just recognize that that's what they're trying to do and go, oh, let's just do it. And we can just, with software, make things easier for people to interact with. And I think that's one of the great gifts of technology, is that, again, it's meant to make lives easier for humans, including if people don't really know which button to push, if they don't really know how to interact, the combination of voice, the combination of gesture, the combination of software that can adjust on the fly to say, hey, this person has a different language or different disability or physical needs or constraints, and we can make systems that everybody can interact with. And I think that's one of the things I'm really excited about, is making things more inclusive and available for everyone. Biometrics. Another thing that we've seen really jump-started because of COVID is the use of biometrics to really confirm who is who. The exciting thing about biometrics for transportation, whether it's aviation or anything that requires identity or payment, is biometrics are really quickly becoming the default form of ID. We were talking about the other day in a project meeting that how long has it been since a wallet was a thing? If we go back a couple hundred years, they may be a little satchel with some little coins or objects of value in it. But the wallet itself has something that held documents and pieces of paper, is a relatively modern invention, and it may not last. We have to challenge ourselves. Well, we'll always have a wallet, will we? What are the things you use in your wallet? What are the things that well, I have to have my license with me. Okay, well, just because you have to, it's a regulation. Okay, but what happens when they're like, yeah, you don't have to have your wallet. You just have to be able to biometrically prove who you are, and then I'll give you that speeding ticket, or I'll issue it to you via camera. So challenge our assumptions that things like biometrics might make things like wallets go away. My dad's getting older, and unfortunately, he loses his wallet about once a week. So thank God we have an electronic towel we can put in there. We can typically figure out which sofa got left in. But again, in the future, biometric might mean we don't have wallets. We have to be able to communicate all this stuff that's going on. 5G, 6G, we've all heard of 5G. Most of us think we have it. But 5G, most of us really haven't experienced the full force of it. We've sort of, sipped on the edge of it, but the full 5G experience isn't always available, and it's still being built out. 6G we've heard of as well, but 6G is still a theory. It's still a working group of people imagining what 6G will be. The only thing we know is the idea of 6G is going to be that it's practically unlimited bandwidth. And here's an interesting idea to get your arms around, is that if we think of communication and bandwidth in the future as being unlimited, and the engineers in the group will say, there's always a limit. There's a technical limit, but yes, but it's almost like the technical limit of, well, how much oxygen is there? You could say, if I step outdoors, in most places anyway, there's more oxygen than you'll ever need. So even though you could theoretically measure how much oxygen exists on the planet, do I need to? No. I just need to know that I could go outside, and as much as I breathe and as deep as I breathe and as how much I exercise, God forbid, that I won't run out of available oxygen. And if somebody's breathing near me, I don't have to say, hey, stop doing that. You're impacting how much oxygen I have available. So the same thing is going to come to communications, that we'll have so much it'll truly be, for all practical purposes, unlimited. And we'll be able to send in real time so much information that we'll be able to truly experience anything that's happening somewhere else, and not have the lag time, not have the judder, not have the the things that indicate I'm not really there. It'll look real because so much of that information, that ultra high fidelity, will be possible because, again, there's more bandwidth than we could ever consume. Let's talk a little bit about AI and machine learning. Again, topics that we've had for a long time. The idea of AI, the idea of having computers do things for us and helping us. And when we think about AI, one of the analogies that I want you to think about is that, there's people that, well, AI is going to do things that I could do. Yes, but it's going to do things that you could do, but it's going to do it in a fraction of the time that it takes you to do them. And we experience technologies like that today, and we have since all of us were children. Things like turning on the water. And it's like, well, yeah, you just turn on the water. You just, in fact, if you go to some places, you don't even have to turn it on. You sort of put your hand in there and the water comes out. Great. Well, think about what it used to be 100 years ago or 200 years ago, where water meant, okay, 20 or 30 or maybe 40% of my day. And getting water meant, okay, do I get the bucket here, or is the bucket left at the well? Do I have to pump? Do I have to put it down? Do I have to pull the rope? How much am I going to lose when I carry it back? All those things you had to do. It's like, well, yeah, a human could do those, and they can still do those. But water became for us the thing that's like, wow, yeah, water. You just turn a knob and you've got water, and or put your hands in a certain spot and water automatically comes out, sort of like it just knew you wanted water. Well, that's the thing AI is going to be able to do. But for a lot of other things in our life, it's going to anticipate and predict and respond and say, automatically do things that if we had the time, we could figure it out. But it's going to be able to make those decisions in the minutes or seconds versus the hours, days, weeks, or months that it might take a human. So again, it relieves us of the burden of having to do all that thinking and just make things a more efficient place for us to do the things that we really want to do as humans, that we care more about. IoT, how do we control all these things? IoT, again, we have to challenge the assumptions of what information we have, what information is available. And IoT is one of those things where simply knowing that all these sources of data can be tapped and say, hey, what exists where? What can I do with it? What decisions can I make because? Internet of Things, even in terms of like your home. And, most of us have a digital thermostat. Most of us, some people have things like a Nest, but even those things that connect to the cloud and say, okay, you detect motion, do this. If you don't, change the temperature. But they're still not that great in terms of knowing, well, who's in the room and what temperature do they want it now? Did Chris just get back from the gym working out and he's a little warm and sweaty, and he wants the temperature a little cooler, but maybe somebody else walks into the room. They weren't at the gym recently and they'd like the temperature a little warmer. So there's a lot of things that IoT still has yet to do that will still, again, provide lots of room for improvement. And again, imagine if transportation organs could use IoT to allocate resources, not only for efficiency, but for convenience, comfort, and just a better overall experience. There's still so much we can do when we understand data in context based on all these devices we have access to. Machine vision. When I was growing up in that little town I showed you a picture of, we had a woman that lived across the street, Mrs. Chelly. And Mrs. Chelly was our version of machine vision, in that somehow she could see us anytime we're outside. Like she had eyes in the back of her head, or was always looking out the window somehow, because anything we did, our mother found out about it really, really quickly. But machine vision allows us to be the Mrs. Chelly of the world by continuously monitoring environments and distinguishing between activities that should be occurring and activities that aren't or shouldn't, and be able to trigger action, whether that's triggering the action, making a phone call and saying, hey, get your kid off the roof, or whatever action that should be. But machine vision, again, the ability to look and see as a human would look and see and make decisions that keep an eye on things. And again, for humans' convenience, for their comfort, for their safety, and again, for a better experience overall. for a machine to be able to look and say, hey, this is getting a little crowded. We need more people here versus there. We need additional resources. Maybe we need more heating or air conditioning because we have more people and need to be heated or cooled. Again, machine vision is that great, wonderful power of being able to just constantly watch and not worry about, oh, I missed it because I wasn't looking there. I was looking away or looking somewhere else. Robotics, a lot of people, when they talk to futurists, say, hey, the future is going to be all about robotics and robotics are going to take our job. I was like, well, I think robotics are first going to take the jobs that we don't want anyway. There's a lot of things that we do that are dangerous, are difficult, less desirable. If I were to ask you to move a mountain of material or a literal small mountain from this location to a location, let's say a mile away, because I want to build something here. In this day and age, you wouldn't think, okay, well, how many men and how many shovels and how many donkeys? You say, well, okay, I'm going to need some people, I'm going to need some humans, but those humans are going to use technology, and that technology is going to help them move that mountain, and it's going to help them do it faster and safer, with less pain and suffering, less danger, than if I were just doing with man and hand tools. Robots are going to be much the same way, doing things that are either dangerous, difficult, or just less desirable, things that we don't want to do. Do we really want somebody to be sweeping and mopping the floors 24/7? We could, and if it gives somebody a job, I'm sure some people will be happy to have that job. But if we can sort of upcycle and say, hey, maybe we take those same people that would be willing to mop the floor 24/7 or for an 8-hour shift and have them do things like maintain the robots, and the robots can, again, do a better job of things that humans don't necessarily need to or want to do. They don't take the time off as long as the maintenance is good and they're charged up and can do what they do. And they can, again, do repetitive tasks. So all of this now starts to get to the point of, well, how do we leverage all these things together? When we have all these great little pieces of technology, how do we make sure that we don't just have a collection of too many things that are all independent? And this is where APIs come in. And again, you've probably heard of APIs, but APIs are becoming more and more of a thing that even people that aren't software designers, aren't software people, can use. No-code APIs are becoming more and more a thing where one piece of software can talk to another, and leverage all the things that each have, and allow third parties to build new solutions that provide value without having to manage and invest in resources. Nobody today has to say, I want something that reacts to the weather. I guess I've got to build a weather software device. No, there's APIs. There's other people that do weather. Take that information and leverage it. There's all sorts of information we can leverage. And I think this is one of the big factors that we have to challenge our assumptions as to where the valuable information is, what I can do with it, and how do I get it to connect to things that already are there and unlock more value. When we access information and leverage it in context, we create more value. And there's just an infinite amount of things that we can connect to and create more value from. Digital twins. So the fact that we've just recently gone through Thanksgiving, I don't know if Thanksgiving is a time when you experiment with new recipes. It can be sort of challenging. We've got a whole lot of people coming over, even a small group, and saying, hey, I'm going to try something for the first time. Well, it's one thing when it's food, and that's even risky, but it's another thing when it's software, hardware, systems. You're like, well, I think this will work. It makes sense on paper. I guess we build it and see what happens. Or increasingly now, we build it in software. We build a digital twin. We build a digital representation of it. And we say, if I include these ingredients and build it in software, what did it taste like? What did it do? Where was the thing where it failed? Where was the thing where it performed well? Digital twins, again, an idea that's been out there for a while, but there's still a lot of people that haven't yet used them or experienced them or understood what they are. But it allows us to really rapidly prototype and iterate in software, in simulation, and then get it right and say, hey, now I know if we build this, I know this will work. I know where the failure points were. We've resolved them without having to actually build it and then see where it failed. Imagine what would have happened if the Wright brothers had digital twins in software. Instead of saying, well, we tried that and almost broke our leg, tried that, almost broke our neck, tried that and crashed. They would have been able to, in software, maybe it would have taken still quite a lot of time, but they would want to say, oh, got it. We figured those things out. Now when we build it, we've at least de-risked it quite a bit. Maybe not 100% because there's still factors that could happen that you just didn't put in your model, but we de-risk it dramatically. And again, low risk testing, faster and cheaper than a real world experiment to really optimize how things work without having to do the trial and error in the real world. So this brings us to how do we keep track of all this stuff? How do we share the information we want to share, we're cool with sharing, and then keep the things that we want private without having to rely on one central authority or one central point of failure. And blockchain. We've heard about blockchain in part because most of us have been aware the last few years of all the activity around Bitcoin, which is one of the first applications built on blockchain. But separate from all the crypto stuff and going to the moon as a crypto person, it's the blockchain really has fantastic application in business, in transportation, to the APIs and IoT and all the things we want to do to share information, to share it in a way that's both private and secure, but open where it needs to be open and transparent where it needs to be transparent. That single source of truth for data and transaction is really going to be a fantastic force multiplier for all sorts of organizations, transportation or others. So that was a really quick spin through some technologies and just some of what comes to mind when I think of them. The real objective here is keep an eye out for new useful technologies and challenge your assumptions. Don't just think, oh yeah, we've heard about that, we know what that is. We all agree. Because when too many people agree on one thing, you have to start thinking like in contrarian and saying, what's the herd missing? What's that big crowd of people missing that it may be a little different, that it could catch us off guard? We have to challenge our assumptions. And let me just end with the idea that we've recently had an infrastructure bill passed, and we're going to get 1 trillion of these flowing into the ecosystem of infrastructure, which includes transportation. And imagine $1 trillion targeted towards infrastructure. That's $1 billion next to a human object there. And 1,000 of those, 1,000 billion, $1 trillion is a lot of money. And we're going to need a plan. We're going to need to think about things in advance before that money becomes available to say, okay, what are we going to do with it? Are we thinking about the right future for how we use that money? How we say, we should do this versus that. It should come over here, back the truck up, and let's unload some of that money over here. And here's where we need to insert the brilliance of the member base of groups like ACT. You guys have the opportunity to, as an association, think through what are the ways that we can leverage technology? How can we apply things and make sure those investment dollars are used in the right way to build things that are really built with the future in mind? That kind of money is like drinking from a fire hose. It's going to come pretty fast and furious, and it's going to feel like this. It's going to feel like just getting a face full. And you're going to say, but you wanted this, right? You wanted all this money flowing into all these projects and all this possibility. But when it's uncontrolled and you haven't had the chance to think about and get everybody on the same page, it's going to feel out of control. All that power is going to sort of, wash over you. You're going to feel like you're drowning versus, actually being able to aim that flow of funds at the right projects in the right way. So as we end, just say, I want you to keep in mind, foresight's more than creativity. Futurists are often looked as, futurists, what do you like, drink wine all day and just, think about crazy stuff? But we actually have methods about it. We actually have process, and it is creative. We have to challenge our assumptions. We really have to think things through in a very methodical way to really get the advantage that foresight can give us. Because at the end of the day, being a futurist is all about, what do I do today? What do I think about today so that tomorrow is going to be better and I'm prepared for next year, next month, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now? Because if you think about it in advance and you can prepare and implement the strategies in the time horizon that's most likely to amplify the impact, you can still do those things on the fly at the last minute, but you're just not going to have as many options if you do it that way. So let's build the future and let's think about it, challenge our assumptions. Let's put it over here.
Excellent. Mike, there's so much you've covered here. And the fire hose analogy, I think, is very apropos, particularly with this, we're being told, generational change of funding for transportation. So I'd love to get your thoughts when you think about, we talked about timeless needs and driving forces and enabling technologies. When $1 trillion of funding presents itself, how do you, as a futurist, what advice would you have on how to parse that funding potential to the fullest and best use? And as you look at all these different technologies you described, I mean, digital twin and API and force multiplier, you know, if you were the chief financial officer for $1 trillion and a futurist,
yeah,
how would you apply the funding with these tools for the best maximum gain?
I think one of the things that we first have to do is look at the efficiency of spend in terms of, if we think about a basic website. I remember a day back in the beginning of internet when, if you want to put up a basic website with like a picture on it and a couple of words and maybe a place to send an email, that would take a team of, 6 or 8 people, 3 to 4 months and maybe 50 grand. Today, you could do that as a kid in kindergarten. Literally just say, go find a place and create a website. You're like, okay, there, I did it. I mean, and it was free, practically free, advertising. But I think we have to challenge our assumptions of what things will cost in the future, because I think there's technologies out there that are going to have exponential impact on what the cost is to achieve the same task. That same timeless need, we say, well, it used to take, 40% of my day to get water to drink. Now it takes me a flip of the switch, and my water bill to drink water is practically nothing. Landscape, another story. But I wish I had a well. But again, we have to challenge our assumptions of what things will cost in the future, because too many people will say, wow, it's going to cost this much just to do these basic things. We don't have time or money to invest in that future stuff. It's like, will it? We have to challenge our assumptions of what things will cost and where we need to prioritize the spend.
So I'm glad you brought up water. So you think about the last time in the United States where there was an enormous amount of capital injected in for infrastructure, and people talk about the New Deal and projects like the Hoover Dam built in the 30s that have huge relevance for decades and decades.
Yeah.
Where do you think those projects are as we look at the next 20, 40, 50 years that are going to be the next Hoover Dam like thing that we should be thinking about that benefits us in the short term, but obviously for generations to come?
I mean, I think when we think out in the future, I mean, how we change, our energy consumption is going to be a big one, right? Solar is growing, but the big story in solar isn't the solar panels as much as it is the battery storage. To be able to say, hey, I can actually store energy. And, not only the lithium iron phosphate stuff in terms of storing energy there, but other mechanisms that if we can solve energy storage, then all these sustainable ways of generating energy become that much more useful, whether it's wind, hydro, solar. Hydrogen is going to be a huge play in the future, again, because it makes sense when we look out and include all the technology capability that's coming online. So again, I think we have to challenge assumptions about what happens in the world we live in today and how things may evolve, and be looking at things that maybe aren't ready for prime time today, but saying, well, what will it take to make that true in 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, and then say, well, let's plan for what that intersection of, the idea plus the capacity to actually do it will be. I see in the chat.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions I was gonna throw out. We've got one about talking about, do you propose solutions besides technological? Electric vehicles don't do anything about congestion, bike lanes, making streets safer for pedestrians. What types of practical applications of things that you think are going to address some of these items?
Sure. Well, when I think about making streets safer, I do think about technology, and that might be the technology of a better helmet, might be the technology of a bike technology that makes it easier for me to not apply the brake too hard and go head over heels, or, wheels that can absorb shock better. But I also thinking about, again, streets tend to be where there's multiple vehicles there, and not all vehicles are bikes. And I think in the future, that's where the technology is really going to be great, that autonomous vehicles is really a team sport. They're going to talk to each other. They're going to communicate information. And one vehicle is going to be able to tell another vehicle, hey, there's somebody riding a bike. You don't see them yet. They're down the street from you, but be aware of them. They're there. There's kids playing in the yard, and that ball might go into the street. Be aware of those things. And so those vehicles be able to talk and adjust their behavior to maybe even take a different road and say, hey, there's 3 or 4 bikes here. You're an autonomous vehicle, or you're a vehicle even driven by a human. Go ahead and take this other street. It's not that much harder. It's no problem. And leave that street for the massive bikers that are on it, and don't try to crowd them out. I think technology will enable us to modulate who's where in a way that we can protect the people that don't have technology on them or with them, and still make it a safer experience for pedestrians, for people that maybe have a harder time getting across the road. People in a wheelchair, we've done research where their biggest fear is, will I be able to get across the intersection in time? Even in a power wheelchair, they don't go fast enough that they're like, will people be able to see me? Am I going to get hit by a car that's going to try to cross an intersection? I mean, how sad is that? That we should be able to use technology to say, hey, if there's somebody trying to cross an intersection, whether in a wheelchair, with a cane or walker, with a bunch of kids that they're trying to corral, the technology should be able to use machine vision, say, hey, keep the light red a little bit longer. They're still trying to cross. Don't just do a timed thing. Go ahead and adjust it so that we can protect people.
You showed something that was really interesting on the digital twinning, and I was thinking about cities. I'm in Lisbon tonight, but looking at a city that's got very narrow streets and lots of structures, and road expansion and infrastructure modernization is very challenging, and it applies to a lot of U.S. cities. How can digital twinning play a role in what the city is going to look like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, and give engineers and people who are responsible for changing the streetscapes and the cityscapes the confidence that the decisions they make today will have lasting impact for years to come?
I mean, I think the digital twins allow us to do simulations and say what might happen if and when. I also think when I think of those experiences, I think material science is going to be great, right? Things where, hey, can I make a different surface? Can I use a different compound or different material that'll wear better, be easier to fix and repair, maybe doesn't need repair as much, maybe doesn't need as much effort and resource to put a new road in, or change a structure. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind too is that as vehicles become more electric, and or even the hybrids today, or gas engines today, quieter, that living next to a major road doesn't need to mean it's going to be loud, doesn't need to mean it's going to be dirty or unpleasant. You may say, hey, I live right next to a highway, it's fantastic. And it's like, really? You chose that? And it's like, well, yeah, because it's quiet, it's clean, it still smells good. I think we need to challenge our assumptions of what, we think of today as negative. Oh, the highway's loud, the street's busy, these is noisy, that's dirty. It's like, it may not be that in the future. It may be really just whisper quiet. You're like, oh, I got a nice breeze from the quiet EVs that are passing by. Oh,
A year ago, Mike, we talked a lot about COVID and the impact it was having in consumer confidence in riding in public transportation and a lot of things. You talked about touchless technology. How would you assess where we are and how that's advancing as far as giving people the confidence to ride on planes and trains and buses and all the things that we need to get around? And where can we expect that to continue to evolve as we go forward? Sure.
So that's a sector that we follow really, really closely. And beyond just touchless, the idea of continuous sanitation. We continue to see dramatic drops in cost for technology that can detect things in the air that are harmful and be able to do it in real time increasingly. So I think as we look forward to the future, to be able to know that you can go into an environment, a building, a store, and know that it's a safe environment, that you're breathing air that's really safe, that's really clean, and that if there is something that's dangerous that walks in, maybe somebody that didn't know they were sick or didn't know they had something that was an issue, the technology will be able to really quickly identify and help that person say, hey, wait a minute, you might have caught it in the parking lot, but there's an issue here, and help them resolve it. To the point where I think it's the better dogs that are out there that can sniff cancer, and we've probably seen those stories on Facebook and things where the dog was able to detect it with their nose. And the technology that's out there today is about 1,000 times better than a dog's nose. So imagine, going for a ride in a taxi or even your own car, and it can detect and say, hey, Chris, call the doctor and have him order you this pill. In fact, we automatically did it and we added it to your pharmacy order. It's like, what's this? Oh, well, you've got this, and oh, here's your prescription for it. We detected it. Imagine what would happen if transportation was also, a medical screening system that would help people catch things before they're really an issue. Say, hey, before this is an issue, you're going to have a cold in about 3 days. We've detected it now. By the way, here's something you should do and take, and you can head that off at the pass before you ever get a sniffle. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And wouldn't that just be great for humanity to be able to detect when people are starting to get ill and be able to give them help and support long before they have symptoms, and at a point in time when you can really have an impact and maybe save their life. Parts per quadrillion is one thing to keep in mind, that these devices can sniff in parts per quadrillion. So dogs can sniff in 1 part per 100,000 or 1 part per million. These devices can sniff in parts per quadrillion.
As usual, you've got our brains going in many directions, which is fantastic. And I know we're at the top of the hour, but want to thank you, Mike, for taking the time to share these thoughts. And I think we'd love to be able to share your presentation if that's possible for those who couldn't attend. Thank you for the questions that you've posted. If you have added questions, let us know offline. We can try to get those answered with Mike. And otherwise, this wraps up our webinar, our last one for Valley of the Sun for 2021. Thank you so much for being part of our programming for the last many months, and we'll be coming out with a new schedule of webinars for 2022 shortly. And Elizabeth, is there any last comments from the ACT National side that you wanted to add?
Well, I'd like to thank the Valley of the Sun again for doing such a great webinar series and for having Mike back. And I'll just say, I hope that I see you all at the TDM Forum on December 14th.
Sounds good. Well, thank you again for joining. Thank you, Mike. And we'll be back in touch with you in the new year and look forward to seeing how many of these different developments become reality as we go into 2022.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks for
Thank you so much.
Have a great rest of your day.
Enjoy Lisbon, Chris.
Thanks.